This is ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by Global Affairs Associates to provide relevant, actionable updates related to business innovation and sustainability. Join Caitlin Allen and Amanda Shea of Global Affairs Associates for thoughtful, nuanced conversations with industry leaders that explore the complexities, the risks, and the opportunities connected to all things ESG. I'm Yvonne Harris, a consultant and co-host, and I will be collaborating with Caitlin and Amanda for the discussions that we will present on this podcast. Put simply, ESG is everything that is not on your balance sheet. This leaves room for misunderstanding, oversimplification, and the tendency towards one-size-fits-all perspectives. None of that will happen on this podcast. Enjoy this episode. Hi, you've tuned in to ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by Global Affairs Associates. I'm Yvonne Harris, and I am joined by Anton Rushakov, a senior consultant with Global Affairs Associates and an expert in climate change risk assessment and climate-related reporting. Thanks for being here today, Anton. Great to spend time with you.
Thank you, Mom. It's good to be here.
So today we are going to talk about greenhouse gases, specifically greenhouse gas emissions, the related reduction targets, and continued focus on decarbonization and net zero carbon goals. So connecting to this very last topic that I mentioned, what does it mean when a company or even a governmental entity talks about net zero carbon goal?
Oh, that's such a great question because actually people mean different things when they talk about this.
Yeah, so tell us.
So it's always important to actually to listen carefully, and if you're not clear, just ask them again. Because we talk about net carbon, so it can be carbon greenhouse gas emissions. It can be greenhouse gas emissions in energy, which typically accounted for about 70 to 80% of all emissions. They come from our energy use. But again, that also can be net zero. You can hear about all renewables in power generation by 2030, for example. That's been part of sort of Green New Deal. You can talk about overall greenhouse gas emissions. So it can be CO2 emissions and also greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions, of course, include methane and other gases. So, but the idea behind net zero is very simple, is that we still produce greenhouse gas emissions, but the balance of carbon in the atmosphere stays the same. So the amount of carbon in the atmosphere stays the same. And the, of course, idea is that historically, the world, we do need carbon in the atmosphere to keep our, planet warm. And for millions of years, there was this carbon kind of cycle and carbon balance. And of course, with human activities, when we started burning, all the fossil fuels that were accumulated, in the ground for hundreds of millions of years, we released a lot of additional. So it was like carbon storage underground. And we released this carbon in our atmosphere, so we kind of disbalance the amount of carbon. So, but in the end, it's all about ensuring that. So we no longer add more carbon into atmosphere. And you also may hear about carbon budgets. And carbon budget is really, so this is kind of modeled and calculated amount of how much more carbon we can put in the atmosphere so we can still stay within 2 degrees temperature increase, right? So historically, again, for thousands of years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. It's called ppm. So you may hear, 280 ppm. We now at 415 ppm. So it's a very significant increase. And we modeled that if we go above 450 ppms, we're definitely going to have increase in temperature more than 2 degrees. So our carbon budget is really, tells us how much more we can emit before we reach 450 ppm of concentration, of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And that's so basically net zero is really about reaching the point where we no longer can add carbon. So basically it really depends on your assumptions about what kind of carbon you calculate, whether it's CO2, whether it's energy related only, all greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why you can see probably different kind of targets in different years. But in the end, the idea is very simple. At some point, we have to balance, and we no longer can emit more in the atmosphere that we produce. So basically, if we continue to produce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to find a way to capture that excess of greenhouses, that to ensure that we're no longer adding more to what's already there.
The U.S. now has increased focus on the Paris Agreement. And talk to us about the connection between net zero carbon goals and the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, right. So Paris Agreement, close to 200 countries agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions so we can stay on the pathway to not increase our temperature by more than 2 degrees, with aspiration actually to keeping it to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So again, the impact of increased concentration of CO2 is cumulative. So every year we add about 40 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Wow.
And again, as we're talking about, so we have different budgets depending on your assumptions. But and you can hear we only have 10 years left, only have 20 years left. But in line with sort of Paris Accord, we have to be on the pathway to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2050. So actually, we need to get to carbon neutral. So we can still produce greenhouse gas emissions, but we no longer can add more greenhouse gas emissions past 2050. In some models, it can be 2070. So really, the agreement is for countries, and each country agreed to so-called national determined contributions. Basically, how much each country can reduce, their greenhouse gas emissions. And it's different for different countries. And of course, there are also all this, discussions about developed countries versus developing countries, and how developed countries kind of already emitted what they should have emitted, and they actually have to act, and developing countries, including China and India, still they have to be allowed to emit more because they're still developing, right? But it's more kind of political aspect of this discussion. But in the end, it is all about ensuring that we can stay within our carbon budget. We can ensure that we do not significantly increase, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, so we can stay within this 2 degrees centigrade temperature increase.
So for organizations, Anton, what are some of the general principles or guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reporting?
Well, so generally speaking, there's a greenhouse gas protocol, which is an international standard. It's been developed with consultation with all the sort of key stakeholders, and it provides guidance on how you can account for greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, this is accounting. It's basically counting each and every kilo of CO2 that, an organization or even person, can emit. So that's guidance. There's also ISO guidance on how you can account for greenhouse gas emissions. And that's it's a voluntary part. So basically, companies can use this guidance to account for their emissions and report them. Also, in different jurisdictions, you may have different regulations requiring companies and organizations to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in the United States, there is greenhouse gas reporting program that is administered by the EPA, and companies that emit significant amount of CO2 in energy sector or in petrochemical sector, in cement steel, they have to report. So there is a certain amount of CO2 you need to report that. In the UK, for example, if an organization consumes more than 40,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, they have to report their greenhouse gas emissions, because obviously, reporting both direct emissions, which come from combustion, so if like you're running your engines, but also there is indirect greenhouse gas emissions. That's basically electricity that we're purchasing, right? And in the United States, for example, there are all these different regions, and they have different power generation profiles, meaning that in Wyoming, probably 80%, if not 90% of all power generation comes from coal. So it's like really heavy carbon. But in California, they have a lot of renewables. So electricity in California is actually significantly less carbon intensive. And there are formulas how you calculate this. I'd say it's not rocket science. There are issues, of course, with boundaries, and there's so-called scope 3, which is everything else, and there are lots of also discussions about what kind of emissions you can include and how you can calculate them, because it's not as straightforward as just calculating your emissions from your combustion, because in diesel fuel, we know how much carbon is in 1 gallon, so it's really easy to calculate. But if you want to know how much carbon is in paperclip that you use, and so then you have to look into the manufacturer and where the steel comes from, and the steel may travel around the world from one place to another, so it gets much more complicated.
I'm so glad you said that, Anton, because you talk about this with relative ease. And of course, I expect that from you, but it's not that easy to many organizations, and they have challenges with the accounting principles surrounding this concept and the reporting. What are some of the common challenges?
I'd say the big challenge is drawing the boundary. And actually, greenhouse gas protocol provides guidance on how you draw a boundary. But again, I'll give you an example from the energy sector. Historically, the big exploration production companies, all exploration production companies, they have to rely on third parties to provide them with services. And this service can be drilling, compression, all kinds of services. And again, an established business practice is that the customer, so the operator, would provide fuel to a drilling company. And as a result, greenhouse gas emissions associated with this fuel kind of recorded by the operator, but not by the drilling company. So the guidance is actually, it doesn't really matter whether it's owned or leased equipment, it's still the operator's responsibility to account for these emissions. But then say you are this drilling company and you want to differentiate yourself as as an efficient and as sort of taking action in terms of reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. It's very difficult actually to get the data about your emissions, because fuel is provided by your customer, and you may not even know how much fuel you burn, because it's not really part of your operations. That's one example. Other examples, when you have like joint ownerships, right? When you have you have your business, but you lease, so you have a huge corporate office, but you don't own the building in which you have your office. So actually it's managed by a different company. So then even if you try, if you want to change, how much emissions you produce, you probably don't really have much control. So greenhouse gas protocol talks about operational control. And again, where you draw the boundary, where you have this control and where you don't have this control. In some cases, it's very clear. In some cases, not so clear. And I think in case oil service providers, there will be discussions between the customers and service providers on how they can find a way of sort of sharing the data. And because it worked before, because nobody really was so much concerned about how much emissions they produced. Now it's really a competitive differentiator. And if you can't capture, if say you're a company that invested in natural gas powered engines, but you can't really capture how much you can actually save, or how much was the reduction of your emissions because you're using natural gas, and you still have to assume that you only burn diesel. It's really challenging. So that's where there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
I recently heard the terminology greenhouse gas emissions as it pertains to scope, and scope 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So scopes, it's a very simple concept, but when you get into detail, it's not always that simple. So
of course.
basically, the scope 1 is so-called direct emissions. So basically, you're driving your car emits CO2. So you burn fuel, you produce emissions. That's scope 1, direct emissions. Indirect emissions, that's basically power use, electricity. So at home, you turn your light on, and it comes from somewhere, right? So it's either coal, maybe it's renewable source of electricity. So that's your scope 2. And scope 3 is everything else. And this can be supply chain. This can be, and with supply chain, as I explained to you, that's, there'd be a paper clip, where did it come from? What kind of steel was used to produce it? Where was produced? Was it produced in China, where it's really carbon intensive? Or maybe it was produced in some other place. Business travel, for example, that's another scope 3, because it's not direct, and it's both business travel and business commute. Then use of refrigerants. We're all using air conditioning, and we know that there is significant, not significant, but there's still there are leaks, that's known, and and that has to be taken into account. Then the most interesting, in case with the energy sector, is that, technically speaking, products that are produced by oil and gas companies, they contain carbon. So gasoline, diesel fuel, kerosene, whatnot, all contains carbon. So for oil and gas producer, actually emissions associated with their operations would be significantly less. Typically, they're 15 or maybe 20% of all the emissions, and 80% of the carbon in their product. And that also sort of creates a challenge, because where again you draw the line, because if you produce a product that contains carbon, but then actual release of this carbon in the atmosphere is done by somebody else, right? So who is really responsible? So some companies now saying, we are responsible, like, Shell, BP, they say, we are going to work on reducing carbon intensity in our products. But it doesn't really, but still, consumers driving their cars, and they're still contributing to the emissions. And that's, so when you talk about scope 3, again, that's it's really not easy to draw a line of responsibility, where the company's responsibilities kind of end and consumers' responsibilities start. That's.
So let's focus on the company responsibility and just the simple concept that, companies are now calculating their greenhouse gas emissions. So once that calculation is determined, what are the reduction and decarbonization options that can then be put in place?
The answer is it's different for different companies. even in the energy sector, when you think about big integrated companies or companies that only operate in downstream sector, like the refineries,
Mhm.
or the operators that actually, produce oil and gas. So, of course, for integrated oil and gas majors, they have many more options than, say, your typical shale oil and gas producer here in Texas. So, of course, they can reduce. So, one area where companies are looking at is electrification and actually purchase of renewable power. I think it was last year, or maybe it was already 2 years ago, that Exxon really made a big news when they signed this power purchase agreement. Basically, they were buying renewable energy to power their shale oil production. But actually, that helps you to reduce your greenhouse, because instead of burning diesel fuel to drive your engines, you buying green electricity. So that's sort of one way of looking how it can be done. Generally improving efficiency, because again, in energy industry, some emergency flaring happens because you can have upsets or something that happens. So the better you run your operations, actually helps to reduce emissions. And then there are different offset options, right? You can buy credits, or you can invest in tree planting. And again, some companies have, so it's so-called nature-based solution, which is actually very important, because really, nature can store a lot of carbon. And it's historically, before people actually came, that it was the case. So actually, we can use the power of nature to store a lot of carbon. Mostly, it's by planting trees, or actually replanting, because we cut a lot of trees, over time, and also soil storage. Actually, soil also can store a lot of, if there is enough vegetation kind of on top, then within soil we can store a lot of carbon. So companies looking at these solutions, and there's no kind of regulated market yet, and there are again issues and arguments about how it can be arranged. It's still voluntary, but it's going to become a major really big part of the solution. And then there's also technology solution, because we always hope that technology can help us to solve all our problems. So carbon capture and storage is a big technology. We have some pilot projects. Actually, unfortunately, in Texas, the only big one has been closed. And
Which one was that one?
I think it was energy power plant. So that basically, it's called industrial capture. So basically, produce CO2 was captured and then piped to be used for enhanced oil recovery. But still, this technology is critical, and we'll hope that it will be brought to industrial scale, because without it, I think part of the sustainable development scenario, developed by International Energy Agency, that sort of shows how we can reach this carbon neutrality by 2050, it's 50%. Actually, carbon capture plays an extremely important role in this scenario. So I think it accounts for about 25% of all emissions that have to be captured and stored. So if we don't have that, it's, achieving our targets will be much more challenging.
You always have so many good examples. Share some examples of organizations that have announced their net zero goals. What are some of the best practices that you've heard from some of these organizations? And then be honest, do the goals seem realistic?
Yeah, I actually, I'm very optimistic about net zero goals.
Okay.
I actually think, even though they're, in some cases, they're 23 years from now, but actually I do think that companies that announce these goals, they're very serious. They're very committed. Yeah, in some cases, it can be extremely challenging. Like, say airline industry. Well, they do have to come. There's no substitute for kerosene, right? We can't really fly planes with electric batteries because they'll be too heavy,
Right.
And finding a way of producing renewable fuel. And there's a lot of work, there's a lot of investment into developing renewable fuel that hopefully will help companies, airlines, to fly carbon neutral planes. But also they can probably do more because the saying goes, so you reduce where you can and then offset where you can't.
I like that. Reduce
Yeah.
where you can, offset where you can't. Okay.
Yeah. So for airlines, and I think for most businesses, there's always be this kind of approach. And we talked about scope 3 in the energy sector. So very good example is Occidental Petroleum. They actually announced that they expect, and they're really kind of the leader in carbon capture and storage technologies, and actually they do both industrial capture, meaning coming from power plants, but also they invest heavily in direct air capture. Basically have this big fans that suck the air and then they get CO2 out of that air, and then you can actually do something with CO2, convert it and make it into a product. So they invest in that as well. So they said that by 2040 we'll be net zero in our operations, and by 2050 we'll be net zero in our products. Meaning that they going to capture and utilize as much CO2 as going to be as their products will contain, right? So on that basis, they will be net zero. I really, encourage, if people sort of really want to learn more about how this can be done in energy sector, they really need to look to Occidental Petroleum and their strategy. And so I think it can be done. If you really put, investment and effort, it can be done. And it's really, obviously, there are a lot of skeptics and they think there's a lot of, sort of greenwashing and, so it's easy to say that, you can be net zero, in 2050, who's going to be, in 2050 to check what you're saying now. But actually other companies actually say we're not going to go that far and we want to have our targets like next 5 years, maybe 10 years. So people who are still in our executive team can be held accountable, in 5 years in terms of, meeting the targets.
I'm with you, Anton. I think these things can happen. I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
It's just, I have to remind myself that 2050 is not as far away as sometimes I think it is. It's a lot to be done still in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. But what's also important is that, yes, we expect companies to do more. We expect companies to get to the zero, but we also responsible as consumers. I think that's something that we have to, because without changing our behavior, our consumption, because when we talk about food consumption, the industry, we know that 30% of all food is basically wasted, right? Because and in many cases it's because the process is set up in such a way that's already assumes waste. Right. We talk about energy efficiency, but we don't really talk about energy conservation. And I think also it's a bit dangerous. I mean, when we talk about affordable energy, accessible energy, of course it's important. But when you think about all the impacts that our energy consumption has on the environment, CO2 emissions, and just, a few weeks ago here in Texas, we had this, crisis because our power system is not winterized, which is
Right.
actually we do have cheap electricity because companies are not investing in resilience.
Hmm.
And that's really the case for climate change, is because yes, it's not particularly good business to invest in resilience and redundancy, right? So because it is expensive, and it's going to get, it's going to be passed on to consumers. But for some reason we get it when we get on the plane. So we do want to have a plane with 2 engines, even though it can fly in one, right? And we want to have 2 people in the cockpit, not just one, even though one person can fly a plane. But when it comes to our energy system, we just think that it can be run by, it can be plane with 1 engine, run by 1 person.
Well, and we know that is now not the case.
Yeah, so now we know, but apparently, 10 years ago, Texas had the same, I wasn't here then, but it was the same type of crisis, and nobody brought, because again, I think the challenge for all of us is that it's like our, survival instinct, that we only fear what we can see, right? Mm-hmm. So when you see plane with 1 engine, you don't want to fly in it. Right. But you can't really see, our energy system the same way, right? Because you see all this, the grid, and you see that you flip the switch and your electricity, your power is on, and you feel like you're safe, but you don't really see how much is behind that. Right. Again, we buy our gasoline, and it's so easy, you put your card in, and you pump your gas, but there's so much infrastructure, there's so much behind that. And I think that it's so important actually to educate people about the energy system, same way as we educate about other things, because that's the only way because when we stick to the message that energies should be affordable and accessible, we give really wrong idea, because this affordability it's a very high cost in the end, and if we, again, going back to the power crisis, well, we're paying low price because we're actually not ready for crisis. And it's hard to argue, of course, how many more this kind of, freezing, events we'll have in Texas in the future because of changing climate, patterns. But once 10 years, and it can become once every 5 years. And again, it may be only 5 days, but if you're not ready, you're going to have half of the state without electricity, and deaths, and, real crisis. But the cost of preparedness is really high. And there's all this balance. And if you say, it's only, let's invest so we can keep the energy affordable. So actually, if you invest, then you have to, make energy more expensive, because that's the only way. Because, again, I like this example of airplane, you're paying for this, you always pay for the second engine, even though technically speaking, you don't really need it, because plane can fly on 1 engine, but you always want to have 2.
Well, and this conversation really, drives the point home from a consumer perspective, Anton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
After, the winter freeze and the crisis here in Texas, not everyone's an expert, but I know many people are saying, I have to be a more informed consumer. I've got to understand more than the end usage, but what's driving the moving parts behind that, and what are some things that I need to be talking to my companies about doing, and understanding and educating more about. So it was a crisis that hit people differently. And I think the vast majority of Texans are saying, what do I need to learn from this? And how do I contribute to the solution?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the preparedness, and back to our, the previous podcast about TCFD, it's really about knowing the risks, because we don't know, and who could expect for something like what happened was last month, right? But you have to look at different scenarios, and you have to assess your risks, because yes, it can happen once every 10 years, or like with Harvey, it was like in 500 years type of. So it's, but there is always this, probability, and it's really, so how much risk you want to take, right? In the end, it's all, because it's always, there's always this cost benefit analysis in the end. So you invest in your resilience, you invest in redundancy, and likely it will help you to survive once every, 10-year crisis better, and with less loss and less damage. But and with climate related risks, because we don't really know their impact, we have to have open mind about the range of risks and their impacts. And we invest now, we'll feel kind of safer later. If we wait, then we'll have to deal, you're out of power. What can you do? And if your system is not winterized, even though, yes, it's not typical for Texas, but it can happen, and then if the likelihood of this is going to increase, of this kind of events can increase, then maybe we should invest more. And maybe then we can say, okay, so I'll have to pay more for electricity, but then I'll use less of this electricity. I'll be, more I'll be savvy consumer. I'm not going to leave my light on all night because I like it. I like the light on when I sleep. So.
Well, that only happens to me when I just fall asleep, right? And
but I think the same way is with because we have this. I'm just driving the same ideas, because we have this idea that energy is cheap and comes basically, and it costs nothing, because my electric bill is like $50-$70 a month. Nothing, right? I spend more money on food, and we still waste a lot of food. Imagine how much energy we waste.
Great takeaways. Anton, we all have just a lot to think about, not only as organizations and business leaders, but as individuals and consumers. And I would even add to this, these are lessons that we need to start teaching our children now, so that, when they become adults, some of the waste issues and inefficiency issues hopefully will no longer be issues.
Yeah, let's hope so. But I think education is key, really, because we have to be better at how we consume, because we talk about sustainability and how we want to sustain our lifestyle and our life standards, but we are consuming obviously more than actually the earth can sustain.
Absolutely.
That's the reality. And only change in our behavior can kind of help us to be sustainable. I think that's the key.
Before I let you go, though, when you're not doing all things climate and climate reporting and climate risk assessment, what do you do for fun? I'm just curious.
Oh, well, I do two things. I cook.
Mm-hmm.
And I cook a lot.
Give me some examples of some dishes you love to make. What are your favorites?
I like doing different soups. So
I'm a soup person.
Hot and sour. There's also this clam chowder. It's called Portuguese fish chowder. This type. I like to make sushis. There's a Japanese store in Houston where they sell, sushi grade fish. So I do it. And the other, I really like to run. So I do running, and I live in Katy, so it's close to the park. And we have really nice paths along the canal and Buffalo Bayou. So I really enjoy watching alligators. And I know them all. I didn't give them names, but basically they're like probably a dozen of them. So I always on the lookout.
That's their neighborhood, right?
Yeah, alligators. So there are people who do bird watching, and I do alligator watching.
That's great.
While I'm running.
Well, thank you so much again. And I'll have to try one of your soups one day. You got me with the hot and sour soup. That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you, Anton, for your time, your thought leadership, for all that you do. I appreciate you being here today. Thank you for listening to ESG Decoded. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and follow ESG Decoded and Global Affairs Associates across social media platforms. Until our next episode, take what you learned today to drive long-term value for your organization by doing good for people and for the planet.